Information, an update to the Facilities Master Plan Task Force. That'll turn it over to you, Dr. Buck.
Welcome, Rob, arriving in real time.
I think he's been lurking in the back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, as you might guess, we had an update from Rob about a month or so ago. I think that's probably about right.
Correct.
And we, since that time, have had 3 community input sessions, and we have also had access to a community-wide survey. So Rob is here this evening, and he's going to give us some information related to that survey, those input sessions, and sort of just a general update since we were last together. So with that, Rob, welcome.
Wonderful. Good evening. What a way to follow. That was quite impressive. I should have recruited some of them to speak to you guys tonight.
Expectations are high, Rob.
I know, they always are here. What I want you to think about is, remember, our tagline is reimagine, re-envision, and reinvest. And those 3 words are important because as I give you this update, we're at a turning point of where we are in this process that we planned back in August. So much like our update that we provided you in April, I believe it was about April 10th, I'm not going to go over all of these slides. This is really for the benefit of those people that are following the process to be able to see how we've gotten to this particular point here in May. So if you remember, we had different roles that we've been trying to follow. We have this ACE concept of academics, culture, and economics, always the driving factor in a lot of the conversation we have with the committee. We finished phase 1, so we won't talk about all of the things that happened in phase 1. We're in the middle of phase 2, and you can see where my red line circle is. Here we are after those public inputs. So the last board meeting we had with you, we were talking about what were we going to learn potentially at those public input sessions. So now, tonight, we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we learned and some of the expectations that the committee will have as we move through the last 3 committee meetings, with the end goal being having a recommendation to you, the Board of Education, about the direction facilities should actually go through. So we had different key elements and goals. I told you the ultimate goal is that recommendation. We went to that public input session. Remember, we had the belief statements, and I think we have over to my right the big poster board that was at each of these public inputs. Those belief statements being a core element of how the committee is moving through the process of establishing what they think the right school size should be, and potentially what this plan ultimately looks like in those 5 key areas. I always want to mention the enrollments. Our focus, for the most part, has really honed in on the elementary level because of the dollars you've already placed in the high schools, and really a lot of the financial and building conditions of the elementary buildings has really kind of created this essence of what could we do with those elementary buildings. But we have about 7,200 students that we're thinking we have over the next 5 years, and likely as we go from years 6 through year 10. We had a lot of budget information. We have a lot more budget information when it comes to the Pebble that we'll be sharing with the committee tomorrow night, related to some information that Steve is, I don't know how he put it all together, but it's really great information to understand what the Pebble dollars will mean. We had a lot of conversation at the public inputs about the reasoning for a 600 elementary size. And a lot of that was well beyond what we would think about with the dollars. It was really about what the experience would be for the students, what the experience would be for the teachers in that building, particularly as it related to the planned learning communities. And if you remember, before that public input session, we had a really good conversation here with the board about what does that really mean as far as what it looks like with your special education population, your ELL population, and whatnot. And I think all of those things are getting put into the mixer for the conversation that we talk about tomorrow. But I thought it was important to note elementary size is more than just the dollars and the efficiency. It's about the experience that may happen in those buildings. Here's another graphic through the data that Steve and Rob provided for each of the facilities that again was on the poster board that illustrated just bringing those buildings up to a particular standard. There's a cost associated, and most all of the buildings are between 11 and 14 million dollars to just bring them up to the standards of the HVAC, the roofing, ADA, security. Nothing about innovative programming per se when we talk about this and what we saw in the building tours. So again, some visual of what that reality is for the existing facilities. We shared this with you based on the individual building and what this potentially would look like as you look at some of the efficiencies, again, from that dollar part. Remember the ACE concept, academics, culture, and economics, focusing, in this case, on these last couple slides, on the economics, the reality of your situation. Ultimately, with the three concepts that went to the public inputs, we had one that was looking at all 600 buildings, so it was option one. We had another option that was looking at 3 450 buildings and 10 or 600 buildings, and then option 3 was 4 450 buildings and 9 600 buildings. Again, looking at some of the limitations or some of the advantages of where those 450s might be more beneficial than a 600 building, and that is related to the site, might be dollars that could be or have been invested in those buildings, where students reside and whatnot. So again, the realities of where we were before those public inputs. So with this, if you can cue up the K-12 survey, I wanted to take some time to walk through the survey piece that really through the partnership with K-12 Insights, a really well-rounded survey to try to get at the work that the committee was presenting at those public inputs, where we were at. So I'm going to try to go through the slides so that you can understand how the questions built into what we can have for some initial takeaways. The other thing that I want you to understand with this is K-12 Insight is still working on some of the data through the survey to pull out some of those other nuggets of how other things are related based on the responses they gave through the survey. So with that, with this survey, I told you it's a partnership with K-12 Insight and RSP, as we tried to help them understand where the committee was at the point of these public inputs, so that we can garner some needed information on, are they going in the right direction? Or a visual that I'd like for you to think about, particularly as we talk about whether it's academic success or the financial realities. If we could go back in time and you think of the Titanic and it's going to hit that iceberg, if that captain had known that they were going to hit that iceberg well back, if he turned the wheel a little bit to miss the iceberg? I think we all could probably say yes. With this facility master plan, some of the things that we're embarking on, the cold realities of where we'll be in 5 years, 10 years, this is very much that same illustration. As we know where we're potentially going to go. Right now we have the opportunity to steer that ship a little bit to miss that iceberg and provide opportunities for these kiddos and for the parents. So with that, take in mind some of the details that we have with this study. The survey ran from April 18th through the 28th, and what we're going to see in these next few slides is how that breakdown was with those particular demographics. We had that 1764 on this particular slide. Those were actually emailed out, so those are likely parents and or staff of that 1764. That 216 number, those are people that went to the survey through the web link. So that gave us a total of about 1,980 responses to the survey. So a lot of responses. You can see the breakdown of how they answered the particular demographic question of whether they were a resident, a guardian, a former student, and whatnot. So again, we have this 1980 as our total number. The next slide of data that were provided from K-12 Insights gives you some information about some of the consensus items, such as learning environments for the students, which is the first bullet point. And you can see whether if it's agree or strongly agree, those are the greens. So where we have a lot of greens, that would indicate that there's some consensus on each of these particular items. And unless you want me to go over each of these specifically, this is what this particular slide addresses. The next couple slides get at what the committee, or not actually the committee, what the community knew at the point of taking this survey. So what did they know about enrollment? Did they know that enrollment used to be at 24,000 students at for the district, and now it's about 16,000? And so you can see that less than 50% knew that that actually was the case. We look at the capacity, and we talk about the underutilization at the elementary level. Again, you can see that less than 40% really knew that that was an actual fact of what was occurring in the district. These two slides, K-12 indicated to me, indicate that if there's more education on what's happened with enrollment, what's happened with the capacity availability, there may be a better understanding of the direction that you all need to go with the usage of your facilities. So that's really good to know that there's that many. The other nugget with those two slides, when we get to some future slides, is that you will see that there's a learned process as the survey takers were taking the survey. And that was kind of one of the things that we were trying to aim for in this survey, was to give them information. If they didn't know the information, then how would they respond to where the committee was at the point of these public inputs? We look at the building age. You can see that greater than 50%, almost 60%, understood that the age of the buildings was quite old. So again, just driving by and then seeing what new facilities look like, there's quite a bit of difference, right? We also see with the school improvement costs, we also see here that we're less than 40% that understood the cost to reinvest in the buildings and how that related to building new buildings that were greater than 50% of the cost to build new buildings and build new 600 buildings. So again, a lack of them understanding what the financial necessities are for the buildings. On this slide, when we're looking at the classroom model, you can see that how the support would be for the students and the teachers with having an up-to-date facility. And you can see that we're at almost 70% understanding that there is a connection between the facilities, the teachers, and the environment the students are able to experience. We look at the number of elementary schools. This was just kind of on its own question to understand what did they think about reducing the elementary inventory. And in this case, there was nothing in the question saying it was going from 21 to 13, just saying reducing the number of elementary inventory. And you can see that we have almost 75% that felt and understood that reducing the inventory could potentially be a good thing for students. We're going to come back to a comparison of slide 11 with slide 13, because again, this is a learned process as they went through this. We then had a breakdown of the questions that were asked about the three concepts. So whether it was all 600 buildings, 450, or 450 buildings. And one of the things that we can take from this is more persons selected responses to option one, which was having 13 600 buildings. You can see we're at about 49% that were at preferred or most preferred feeling about option one. If you go back to those slides, I think 5 and 7, when you look at what they knew about the buildings, the enrollment, the capacity, the finances, that's quite remarkable that through this process we have almost 50% that are understanding with concept one what that means with reducing the inventory. Option 2, you can see, was at about 45%. Option 3, about 40%. And then when we get to people that would prefer something different than what they see, we have 34% of those respondents saying they potentially thought something different should be considered. The value, this is where I take a little bird dog before we finish with some of these survey, that's the value of this process that you guys agreed to back in August. This information is going to go to the committee tomorrow night, and they're going to have time to digest what this means and understand if the direction is 13 buildings, maybe it's something different, based on what we're seeing with the responses here, what the committee members heard at those 3 public inputs, all of the Let's Talk comments that occurred those 3 nights at the public input, that will be infused in the dialogue tomorrow night with the committee to help come to what their consensus is to start building upon what we've learned in this process. So if we come to slide 13, I said slide 11 and 13 kind of show you a change in where now they're given all of that information previously that they maybe had known or did not know was put into this question. So the number of students, the capacity, the financial implications of replacement versus building new, and we see that there's been a little bit of change if we compared slide 11 to slide 13. What K-12 Insight will be able to provide us as they dig into this data is who moved between those subgroups. Did we see new people that, let's say, were at support, did they move down to saying that they have no opinion or they oppose, or did we see people that were opposed move up their chain as they understood the information? So this answer and how they answered the other questions, we're going to start seeing that connectivity. But again, we see that we're at 76% that are in favor of going from this 21 to 13. I shouldn't say favored, they have some sort of positive feeling toward what that may mean for the experience of students and whatnot. The reality when we roll out a plan, because at this point we don't know which sites, which buildings, specifically, do we have 450 buildings that maybe relate to the conditions of the sites, like let's say Johnson and Taylor? Do we have other things that we may want to consider with, let's say, Grant or Hiawatha or Viola Gibson with investments or the newness of Viola Gibson? So there's some things that the committee, as I said, they're going to have to dig into in these next 3 committee meetings. They're going to help provide that framework for what this recommendation could look like. As we moved into the secondary components of this with the middle schools, you can see that the 2 different questions that we have here with the middle school and the high school, you can see that when we're asking, are there other improvements that need to be made to the district with the middle schools, we have less than 50% that say something should be done to the middle schools, and at the high school, less than 37%. I think at the high school, that's attributed to, I think, Steve, was it roughly $80 million over the last 7 years that you've invested in those buildings? That's likely why that's as low as it is. Middle school, I personally think is people don't understand middle schools. I have middle school students, so I don't understand my middle school students. So what is that experience like, and what does that space need to be for middle school students? There's probably some more information that will be able to be pulled out of that middle school component.
Was there any information about middle schools in any of this, or has there been information about middle school potential improvements throughout this process?
Yeah, good.
And we're focused on elementary. so
Good question. With the committee, the focus has been on the Pebble funds that would be allocated towards the middle school and the high school. Then at the middle school level, there's been conversation of relocating Metro High School to one of the middle schools. There's been a little bit of conversation. We'll see how it happens over the next few committee meetings of could you repurpose a middle school? And this is where I can't remember if when I spoke to the board, when you take these 800 to 1,000 capacity middle schools, make it an elementary, and then you match that up to the committee saying 600 was really the most they wanted to see in elementary. There's maybe some opportunities, but there's some challenges with those middle schools to do that repurposing. So there's been some conversation, but the bulk of the work the committee's been focused on has been at the elementary, because we've done a lot of work at the high school, and then with the middle school, we know there's quite a bit of available capacity, but when we look at the cost to build a new middle school versus the improvements that need to be done to a middle school, they don't rise to the level of cost of that greater than 50%. That's kind of been the benchmark we've been utilizing in the committee for why you might consider a new building versus refurbishing, renovating an existing elementary building. Kind of wordy, but that's...
No, thank you.
I
Do we,
believe in that
Rob,
survey.
do we have the information of what the needed renovations to the middle schools, what that projection looks like over the next 5 years. I know we've done some investments with HVAC and to some of them and so on, but they're still ongoing. I would like to just see how that breakdown is to what a replacement of a middle school would cost and where we're at with some of the renovation and so on.
Absolutely, we can make note. We have cost estimates that Steve has provided with the middle school, but absolutely get that to you.
Because I think also is a key that the design of the space and what a middle school design could look like and how it fits into, again, some fairly old, in some cases, facilities. So even maybe not cost-wise efficient, but learning-wise and what we want to see. So I hate to see elementary students going to a 21st century building and then being squeezed into a 20th century middle school.
That's a good point, and let me bring up one of the things that when we get to this efficiency, I think it was kind of one of those aha moments with administration as they ran the numbers, is when you get to the ultimate efficiency. I mean, not only are these educational benefits, but with, I believe it would be about 2.5 million, is that correct, Steve? But 2.5 million annual savings when you get to this efficiency level. Well, that could then mean when we're talking about the middle school that you go back to the middle school teaming concept that has been seen as most ideal for the middle school experience. So there's some things that could bridge the gap of the conditions of the facilities and how you're able to program. But we absolutely will give you that information because it's a value of this whole process, the facility master plan, right? Good questions. This next question that was on the survey related to Metro High School. And we can see that we're at about 64% support or strongly supports that program being moved to a space that would better equip the needs those students have. So already that's, I think, quite remarkable because a lot of people don't even understand probably what happens with those Metro High students. And so the more exposure they have to what that program is and the spaces they need, we already have a 64% supports for understanding what that may mean. So then the last things that K-12 wanted to kind of note was really each of these 5 bullet points. And I think it was this 91% of the participating community members agreed or strongly agreed that the district must be responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. I think that's good because whatever plan that moves forward, it's going to have to showcase that good stewardship, right? And I think you guys have done a good job trying to advocate and move that in that direction. And this goes back to that iceberg. If we know that there's some financial things that are going to impact what educationally can happen here, we're at the point in time where we can make some of those adjustments. The second bullet point, that gets back to those demographic details about capacity and whatnot, that there's some more work that we can do through this process, through the district educating and making people aware of the conditions that these buildings are in and why they need to change to provide students being able to be college and or career successful. If we look at then the next bullet points, you can see that 71% of the participants strongly supported the number of elementary schools being reduced. So I think they're seeing that there's that inefficiency, the good stewardship, they're making that connection. We go to the next bullet points, you can see that there was greater, 72% of the participants expressed some level of support from going from 21 to 13 buildings, and it had the greatest amount of support with those 600 students elementaries. And that kind of, again, parallels a lot of the conversation we've had in the committee. We got to option 2 and the option 3 related to some of these aha moments about site conditions and whatnot. So we'll see how this kind of runs through the conversation with the committee. Last point to all of this. that I think is important for anyone that's listening in on this. This is a very transparent process. There's not been administration, I know most assuredly you as the board, and even our RSP team in saying, here's what you need to do. Where we've been landing with the committee is through their conversation, their investigation, the information that they're provided with the reality of what's happening in this district. And I think that's the most important thing to take away, because sometimes when you take these surveys, you think, hey, are they trying to get us to say this and this so that they do X, Y, and Z? And honestly, what we tried to work with K-12 Insight on was creating a survey that we could get some sort of understanding of what the community might think these three different concepts, these three different options, where they were headed. Are we on the right track? Do we need to change and go down a different path? And I think from the responses on this initial analysis we've been provided, it seems to indicate we're probably on the right track at all levels, elementary, middle school, and high school. With that, I open up to some questions, comments that you may have, and then I may have a couple slides if we switch back to the other that'll kind of take us to where we go from here.
Any questions? I do have a question. So finances, I know, Steve, you provided a lot of information that was in that first sheet. But when the folks took the survey, were they aware that these prices are not, I mean, the goal has been not to raise taxes to do this. I mean, if we have the legislative extension of the 1 cent sales tax for school infrastructure, SAVE, that's the goal, to keep that within that stream and not to go out and ask for additional dollars. Is that correct?
President Lavery, that is correct. You know, all of the analysis that we have done are based upon the SAFE Fund extension through 2050, and looking at what we have currently obligated in the SAFE Fund for the things that we're spending money on now. We could have our first debt issuance on July the 1st of 2020, and about every 5 years have a smaller debt issuance incrementally, but a fairly large one, about $220 million in 2020 we would be able to start with. So there is capacity to fund this plan within SAVE over the horizon should we be extended without any reductions, any diversions of these resources to other non-school infrastructure needs. We would have the resources to do this.
Thank you. Other questions? Keith?
I'd like to see a comparison of the voters that vote in school elections and so on. And I think we have this data of how many actually have children in the students and the people that are voting. This study is obviously district residents, and I think that's a relatively good turnout on a survey like this. Is that right?
Correct.
But, you know, the picture of the total population of the community, I'm not sure that this is such a good representation of those that, what percentage is it that actually have students in the district right now? It's under 20%, something like
About
that.
25%. We usually say about 25%. I don't know if that's still accurate or not.
So, you know, so we can get a comparison of the total support of the community, and then, you know, other groups in the community of the support that would be out there. And this is a great beginning, I guess, but like to hear more from other communities and groups and so on. And also informationally, you know, what's going on, what are we trying to do, et cetera.
Are you talking about surrounding communities that are
No,
doing this, or
no, I
people
mean
that are within the
This
community?
This,
So I know one of the things you've tried to do, at least, is in the committee that's looking at this, is have representation across lots of different demographics. And I don't know, what was it, almost 100 people, 90 to 100 people involved?
Yeah, and they're involved, could be city persons, business owners. There's a whole collective across the district. We even have, I believe, 2 or 3 people that they don't even send their kids to Cedar Rapids schools. They've sent them to private or parochial. So there's a sample. Now, does that represent, as you're indicating, the entire community? No, but at least we're trying to, with the committee, reach out and get their understanding as a taxpayer, maybe not someone sending to receive the services, but their feelings of what would be best for this community.
So one thing that I had, Rob,
Raphael?
oh, sorry. Or did any of you guys had something else? Gary, I think? Okay. So I'm looking at the participation. I mean, 1,900 total responses, not ideal. I understand that. I think it was better than what happened in December. I'm thinking about the information from the public input sessions. Do we have any kind of rough idea of how many people attended? And I think you said K-12 Insights is still working through that information that'll be presented tomorrow. Is that right?
That's correct. What we
Okay.
have from the survey is we had a program that was set up through K-12 Insight that was called Let's Talk. And people were able to provide their initial feedback of what their perceptions were of those 3 concepts, or what they learned in that process. That information is going to be provided to the committee, and it's as you can imagine, as people typed, it's
Right.
like free flow. And so to extrapolate out specifically how that relates to this, K-12 Insight is working on that, because they don't want to put things into what they wrote that means something different than what they actually typed
Right,
in.
because I'd be interested in that to see if they kind of match up in some way with what showed up on this particular survey. Because, from what's here, it's clear that we have a huge opportunity as a board and as a district to further that communication and education of what the needs are currently and what the needs are going to be in the future, and making sure that community members, parents of future students, current students, that they're aware of what's actually out there and what we're looking at for the future to actually do. So I'd be interested to see that. Is that information that would be available to us as well tomorrow once it's put together?
Absolutely.
Okay. Do you know if it'll end up being similar to this, or do you have any idea on format or what it might look like?
What the format will be that we can make available is literally what they typed in.
Okay.
And what that data dump looks like. We've contemplated, do we clean up the prose? But in some ways, it just, for transparency, it may just make it better that this is what they typed in. We don't try to make any determination of what that might.
Okay, so it might be a little bit unwieldy, at least to start with.
It might be. There's about, I think, 6 word pages between the three nights.
Okay.
I think it was about 2 pages each night.
All right.
Gary?
I think from experience that I have seen and other board members in this community, it's hypothetical now, and people tend to be a little bit more neutral when it is. When it starts getting down to more specifics, and it's, oh, I didn't know you were talking about my area. I didn't know you were talking about my school. Then there seems to be a different reflective process that goes into from the public as that happens. And I understand the process we're in now. We have to have some direction going forward to present to the community. I guess I'm just, with the survey and so on, I'm just a little bit, take it with a grain of salt that this is where we are right now, but as we move along, there will be, I think, more comments and more discussion that will occur as a result of it. And the other, after going through this legislative session, I'm a little leery of where we are with the 1 cent, with the extension of the SAVE. I believe that there probably will be something, but they have a year to think about it, and I think that's dangerous as they sit back and what they can do with. So there may be an extension, but I'm afraid there may be amendments that would be attached to it as we move forward. So plans would need to be flexible, I think, as we move until we actually see what happens with that funding.
Other questions or comments? I would just say, too, for the board to keep in mind that we do have an active committee appointed by the board that's been appointed for the purpose of taking this information and helping us evaluate it. So just as board members, to be somewhat cautious about diving too deep into specifics at this point. At this point, that may not be the role of the board, so you're all individually elected, you can do how you want, but I think this process has been laid out, we sort of agreed to it. So, we have this touch point, we have more committee meetings coming up, and another touch point. So these are really great times to ask questions, to ask maybe a direction that we'd like to see this committee go deeper into, but for us to make, references or to start formulating decisions at this point, maybe still just a little bit too premature. But don't hesitate to ask the committee, Dr. Buck, Rob, if there are things that we need to know as a board as it gets down to this final recommendation. And again, at that point, it really does, a lot of this will matter on finances, obviously, so we're all keenly aware of that. And depending on the finances, who knows? I know for myself and the rest of the board, we've agreed that we're not making a decision at this point. We may have individual understandings. Some of us have more information. Our kids have gone through more recently than others, whatever the case may be. But really relying on that committee of citizens that are across the spectrum to help us with that decision. So we want to applaud them and Rob for your work helping us get through that. 11% response rate on that survey, from what I know about surveying, is actually a pretty good response rate, especially if it was across that spectrum. So that's certainly helpful. And the more of those types of pieces of information we can get, the more healthy of a decision I guess we'll have. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? Brad, anything else, Rob?
Nope.
I would just kick out, I'm sorry, Rob, go
Go
ahead.
ahead, go ahead.
So just one other reminder, we have that timeline in front of us. So Rob and his team will be in front of this board in the second board meeting in September, that first meeting in October with some recommendations, an opportunity for public input, and then some final recommendations and a plan. So Gary, your points around level of specificity and feedback, that's likely to get tightened up as we get more information from the board. Yeah, so that's fair.
And I think I'm sure this will come, but in plenty of time before September 25th and October 9th and so forth, we'd like to have a discussion with administration and recommendations of what's worked in the past best for those public input sessions at the end of this process or towards the end of the process, because again, getting as many voices, being as transparent as possible in this, I know is important to this board. So, but sooner than later, we'd like to have sort of that discussion so that the board can respond to that in a public, transparent way. All right. Anything else, Rob? Or?
Nope, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your work on this in the committees. So, all right.